The little girl walked straight toward him. People saw him. Of course they did. You could not be in the same aisle as this man and not register him the way you register a change in temperature, immediately and in the body. Adults found reasons to drift to other sections. A woman with a trolley adjusted her trajectory without making it obvious she had adjusted it. A man pretending to look at pasta sauce found the pasta sauce very interesting for a long, deliberate moment. The aisle gave him space. The way the ocean gives an underwater current space, moving around it without touching it, without entirely knowing why. And 6-year-old Cheris King, bunny ears on her hood, small bag swinging off her shoulder, walked directly toward the most dangerous-looking man in the room with the calm, purposeful stride of someone who had identified a problem and intended to solve it. She stopped in front of him, looked up. He looked down. And she said, simply, factually, without a single tremor in her small voice, "You're bleeding." He said nothing. She tilted her head, studying him the way a doctor studies something before making a diagnosis. "Did someone hurt you? Or did you hurt someone?" She folded her arms and looked more closely at him. "A beat. A real one, the kind that sits in the air. My mom says people who hurt others are bad people." She held his gaze with eyes that had absolutely no fear in them, not the performed bravery of a child daring herself, not ignorance, just no fear, like she had looked at him and done a calculation and the answer that came back was simply, "Not dangerous to me." "So, are you a bad man?" He did not answer. She unzipped her bag, pulled out a bandage, cheerful, pink star-patterned, the children's kind. "You have to come down to my level a little. I'm not yet so tall like you, but I have potentials." She reached up and placed it above his eyebrow like she'd done this exact thing 100 times before and would do it 100 times again, and saw absolutely nothing unusual about any of it. Then she looked at his knuckles. "Your hands, too. And if you want to know how a 6-year-old with a bandage in an ordinary Seoul supermarket became the beginning of the most unexpected love story this city has ever seen, subscribe and don't move, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from, because we are going all the way back to Atlanta first. 3 years before that supermarket. Diana King was 24 years old, brilliant, board-certified in emergency medicine, and she was standing in the kitchen of the house she shared with her husband at 2 in the morning, replaying a conversation in her head for the 4th time, trying to find the version of it where she hadn't said the wrong thing. She always found it eventually, the version where she was the problem. That was the thing about Henry, he was never loud about it, never dramatic. He didn't throw things or shout, he was far too intelligent for that, and intelligence, she had learned, was not always a safe thing in a man. He simply had a way of making her feel, quietly, systematically, over a period of years, that her own reading of reality was slightly off. That her instincts were good for a normal person, but that she had a tendency to overreact, to misread, to take things too personally. He said this gently. He said it with such sincere-sounding concern that she had spent the first 2 years thanking him for it. She had been a top-of-her-class medical student when she met him, sharp, certain, the kind of woman who walked into a room and immediately understood the situation. By year 2 of the marriage, she second-guessed everything she understood. By year 3, she had quietly, invisibly, over 6 careful weeks, copied every document she needed, moved a portion of her salary to an account he didn't know about, identified a job offer from Severance Hospital in Seoul that she'd been sitting on for 3 months without telling him, and planned an exit with the same methodical precision she brought to emergency medicine. She left on a Thursday, 2 in the morning, Cheris in her car seat asleep, 3 bags. She drove to her mother's, sat in that kitchen until 4 a.m. shaking, and then she stopped shaking because she needed to. She chose Seoul because it was far, because nobody knew her name there, because distance was sometimes the only architecture that actually worked. You needed enough space between the building and the wreckage that one's shadow couldn't fall on the other. Because Cheris was 3 years old and had her whole life in front of her, and Diana had decided, in that 4 a.m. kitchen, that she would build that life somewhere clean, somewhere new, somewhere nobody could reach them. Seoul was the somewhere. Severance Hospital was the anchor. And for 2 years, she built exactly what she'd promised herself. A good ward, a warm apartment, a daughter who grew up confident and fearless and entirely her own person, which, if Diana was being honest, had less to do with her parenting and more to do with the fact that Cheris had arrived in the world with her own strong opinions about everything and had simply been that way since birth. It was 3:47 in the afternoon in a busy supermarket in the Mapo district of Seoul. Everyone is moving, but nobody is rushing. Parents with strollers, elderly couples with careful lists, office workers on lunch breaks extended 10 minutes too long. It was ordinary. It was full of life and noise and the small, beautiful mundanity of people just living. And then he walked in. And it stopped being ordinary. You know how you can feel a room change before you can explain why? The music didn't stop. The lights didn't flicker. Nobody screamed. But something shifted, the way the air shifts before a storm even before the clouds arrive, and one by one, without coordinating, without deciding to, people began to give him space. He moved through the entrance like a man who had never once in his life needed to excuse himself for taking up space. His face was calm, not the calm of a man at peace, but the calm of a man who had trained himself so completely to show nothing that showing nothing had become his face. There was a cut above his left eyebrow, fresh, still catching light when he turned his head. His right hand, hanging at his side, the knuckles were split. Dark, raw, the kind of marks that don't come from a wall or a doorframe no matter how many times people say that's what happened. A woman with a trolley adjusted her trajectory. Without making it obvious, she had adjusted it. A man pretending to look at pasta sauce found the pasta sauce very interesting for a long, deliberate moment. Nobody made a scene. Nobody said anything. They just moved. The way people move around something they've assessed as dangerous without wanting to acknowledge that they've assessed anything at all. He walked on, unbothered, used to it. Small footsteps. Cheris King was 6 years old. She was wearing a yellow coat with bunny ears on the hood, and she was approximately 11 steps ahead of her mother, which was exactly where she operated at all times, not far enough to be lost, not close enough to be supervised, right in the sweet spot of her own complete independence. She had been studying the yogurt section with the focused attention of a scientist evaluating data when she looked up and saw him. She didn't look away. She looked at him the way she looked at everything, directly, without self-consciousness, processing. She saw the cut. She saw the knuckles. She saw the space everyone was creating around him that he didn't seem to notice or perhaps had simply stopped noticing long ago. She tilted her head. Then she walked toward him. No hesitation, no calculation, just walked. The small, serious walk of a child who has identified a situation that requires her involvement. He heard the footsteps and looked down. A small girl in a yellow coat with bunny ears was standing in front of him, looking up with large, calm, gray, beautiful eyes that contained absolutely no fear. Not performing bravery. Not pretending not to be scared. Just genuinely, completely unbothered. He didn't know what to do with that. He hadn't known what to do with it in a very long time. She looked at his eyebrow, then at his hand. "You're bleeding," she said. Simple, factual, the tone of someone reporting observable data. He said nothing. She looked up at his face again, studying, the particular studying of a child who is trying to work something out. "Did someone hurt you?" she asked. "Or did you hurt someone?" She folded her arms and looked at him. The question landed without drama. Just honest, clear, the way children ask things, without awareness that the question might be complicated, without any concern for whether it was comfortable to answer. A beat of silence. Then her eyes stayed steady on his, and she said, in a voice that was not accusing, not afraid, just genuinely wondering, "My mom says people who hurt others are bad people." A pause, small, waited. "So, are you a bad man?" He froze. Not visibly, not the kind of freeze anyone watching would have caught, But something inside him, something that had not moved in years, went completely still. Because people did not ask him questions like that. And strangers looked away. Strangers most certainly did not walk up to him in a supermarket with bunny ears on their hood and ask him, directly and without flinching, whether he was a bad man. Something moved across his face. Not anger, not irritation. Something older and quieter than both of those things, something he didn't have a clean name for anymore. She was still watching him, patient, waiting. He didn't answer. He didn't know how to answer. He wasn't sure if he was being honest that he knew what the answer was. She seemed to accept this not as avoidance but as a kind of answer in itself. She reached into the small bag hanging off her shoulder. The bag her mother called her emergency bag, the one Charis had packed herself and considered non-negotiable on every trip anywhere. Tissues, a granola bar, antibacterial cream, 3 bandages, the good kind, the padded kind, the kind with the small, cheerful pattern on the strip. "Wait," she said, "don't move." She pulled out a bandage, looked at his eyebrow, looked at her height, looked at his eyebrow again. Then she looked at him with an expression that said clearly, "This is going to require your cooperation, and I expect you to provide it." He didn't know why he bent down. He just did. She pressed the bandage above his eyebrow with 2 small fingers, carefully, smoothing each edge. Checked it, satisfied. Then she looked at his knuckles, and the expression on her face was the specific expression of someone who has found a second problem and is prepared to handle it too. She opened the antibacterial cream, applied it to his right knuckles with the efficient seriousness of someone who had been watching medical procedures since she was old enough to watch anything. He let her. He couldn't have explained to anyone why he let her. He just let her. She pressed the second bandage across the worst of the cuts, smoothed it, patted it once lightly, the way you pat something when you're satisfied with your work. Then she looked up at him. "You should stop fighting people," she said, calm, certain, not a lecture, just a fact she was sharing. "Good people don't do that." He looked down at her. And the thing that crossed his face then, the thing that moved through his eyes for just a second before he caught it, was not what anyone who knew Li Wang would have predicted. It wasn't dismissal. It wasn't amusement. It was something that looked, just briefly, like being seen. "Charis." The voice came from the end of the aisle. Controlled. Careful. The voice of a woman who had already assessed the situation in the 3 seconds since she'd looked up from the shelf and found her daughter standing within arm's reach of him. Diana King walked toward them with the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone who understood that the most dangerous thing she could do right now was panic. She was in her off-duty clothes, dark jeans, a rust-colored jacket, her natural hair pulled back, a grocery basket in one hand. She looked like what she was, a woman in her early 30s who was competent and careful, and had learned, through specific hard experience, exactly how to move through spaces that required her to stay calm. She reached Charis, put a hand on her daughter's shoulder, looked at the man. He looked at her, and for a fraction of a second, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic, not the kind of thing anyone else in the aisle would have noticed. His expression didn't change, his posture didn't move. But his eyes stayed on her a moment longer than they should have. Long enough to register. The way she held herself, calm, controlled, not panicked even now. The way her voice, when she spoke to her daughter, carried steadiness instead of fear. She took in the bandage above his eyebrow, the small, cheerful one with the pattern her daughter favored. Took in his face, his hands, his stillness, the space the entire rest of the supermarket was maintaining around him. She understood in the space of 2 seconds more than most people would have in 2 minutes. She was a doctor. Reading a situation quickly and accurately was not a skill she'd studied. It was a reflex. He hadn't moved. He hadn't stepped toward Charis. He hadn't said a word. He had just stood there and let a 6-year-old put a bandage on his face. She held his gaze for 1 steady second. Then, "Come on, baby," she said to Charis, soft just for Charis. She took her daughter's hand. No drama, no scene. She just turned and walked and took Charis with her. Charis went, but she turned back once. Just once. Looking at him over her shoulder with those calm, curious, beautiful gray eyes. He stood at the end of the aisle and watched them go, in the way you stand when something has just happened to you that you don't have a category for yet. His name was Li Wang, and he was not exactly a good man. He would tell you that himself, directly, calmly, the way you state facts about geography or weather. He had built his life inside a world that operated on power and silence, and the specific understanding that asking the wrong questions could have consequences nobody wanted to discuss out loud. His apartment was on the 24th floor of a building in Yongsan. Expensive, tasteful, aggressively impersonal, the kind of space that communicated success without communicating anything about the person living in it. Dark wood, clean lines, a view of Seoul at night that should have felt like a reward and mostly just felt like a view. He poured a whiskey, walked through the apartment on autopilot, shrugged off his coat. Passed the bathroom mirror. Stopped. He looked at his reflection for a moment, the way you look at something you've passed 1,000 times and suddenly noticed for the first time. His face, the cut on his eyebrow. The bandage. Small, slightly lopsided at the left edge because she'd applied it from below and her angle wasn't perfect. A pale blue background with tiny white stars, the kind of bandage that came in a children's variety pack. A 6-year-old had put that there. He stood there for a long time, just looking at it. He thought about her face, the complete and total absence of hesitation, the way she'd walked toward him when everyone else had walked away, not because she was showing off, not because she was dared, not because she didn't understand what she was looking at. She had understood. She had looked at him and understood and simply decided that the understanding didn't change what needed to be done, which was to help. That child had had no angle. Zero. In his entire adult life, he could count the people who had approached him without an agenda on significantly less than one hand. Everyone wanted something. Everyone was operating from some calculation, some position, some need he was useful for. She had seen a wound and she had fixed it. That was the whole story. No calculation, no agenda, just help. He turned away from the mirror and went to sit on the couch, whiskey in hand. He thought about what she'd said. "Are you a bad man?" The question had not left him. It had been sitting in his chest since the moment she asked it, this small, plain, honest question, and the thing that unsettled him wasn't the question itself. It was that he hadn't answered, not because he didn't want to, because he genuinely wasn't sure. He'd been many things in his life, and he'd had words for all of them: strategic, necessary, efficient, powerful. He had not spent much time asking himself whether he was bad because the world he operated in didn't sort people that way, and he'd stopped expecting to be sorted that way a long time ago. He thought about the mother. But she hadn't panicked, hadn't grabbed the child away violently, hadn't made it ugly. She'd just taken her daughter and left with the quiet dignity of someone who was scared and competent at the same time. He respected that more than he wanted to. He looked at his knuckles, at the second bandage, already catching at one corner. He pressed it back down. He finished the whiskey and went to the bathroom, looked at the star-patterned bandage one more time. Then he did something he couldn't explain to himself. He peeled it off carefully, looked at it for a moment, this small, silly, star-covered square that a child had carried in her emergency bag, because 3 was enough for any crisis she could imagine. He opened the drawer by the sink, placed it inside, closed the drawer. He went to bed. He didn't sleep for a long time. But for the first time in longer than he could honestly remember, what kept him awake wasn't business. For the first time in a long time, someone hadn't looked at him with fear. And somehow that stayed with him. The Seoul International Healthcare Investment Gala Summit drew 300 people from medicine, biotech, and private capital. Li Wang attended because his organization had interests in pharmaceutical logistics, the clean, legitimate kind. The kind that didn't require explanation at dinner parties, and certain alliances required his face in certain rooms. He was near the far end of the reception hall, glass in hand, performing the particular kind of presence that events like this required, visible enough to be noted, distant enough to remain unapproachable, when he heard a voice. "Excuse me." He looked down. She was wearing a navy dress with a white collar, hair in 2 puffs, iPad tucked under one arm with the comfort of someone who considered it a limb, looking up at him with the same expression she'd had in the supermarket, calm, certain, the expression of someone who has spotted a situation and decided to handle it. "We've met before, but I didn't introduce myself properly. My name is Charis King. We met at the supermarket some days back. You were bleeding." He stared at her. "I remember you," he said. "Good," she nodded, confirmed. "So what's your name, mister?" she asked. "Lee Wang," he said calmly. "Lee, okay. Do you work here or are you a guest?" she said simply. "A guest." "Are you enjoying it?" she asked again. He considered the answer. The honest one versus the diplomatic one versus the one he usually produced at events like this, which was neither honest nor dishonest, but simply correct. "Not particularly." "Me neither," Charis said. "There are no children here except me, and the food portions are very small. Why is the food so small? Is that something rich people do on purpose?" He laughed. It came out before he could do anything about it. A real laugh, pulled out of a part of him that didn't usually get consulted at events like this. And it was so abrupt and so genuine that the couple standing 4 feet away both turned to look at him with the particular expression of people who have never heard that sound come from that face. "I think it might be, yes." "That's a very strange choice. If I had a lot of money, I would have very large food, big portions. Anyway, your face, you still have my bandage on." His hand went to his eyebrow. The bandage was still there. He had put a fresh one on when the first one had needed replacing, because it hadn't occurred to him not to. He had registered that fact briefly at the time and had filed it under "deal with that later." Later was apparently still in progress. "I kept it on," he replied. "Does it still hurt?" "Not anymore," he said. "Good. What about your hand?" He held out his right hand. She took it in both of hers, completely without self-consciousness, the way young children handle other people's bodies, as though the usual adult rules about physical space hadn't been explained to them yet, or, having been explained, hadn't seemed entirely compelling. She turned his hand over, examined the knuckles with professional focus. "Okay, that looks much better. You heal quickly. That's a good quality in a person." She released his hand and looked at her iPad, tapping something rapidly. He watched her. "What are you doing?" Charis replied, "Sending my mum an update. She worries when I'm not visible at events, so we made a system. I send her a message every 15 minutes telling her where I am and that I'm fine, and she doesn't have to interrupt her conversations to come and check on me, and I don't have to stand beside her while adults discuss things I don't understand yet. It's a mutual agreement. We negotiated it." He looked at the iPad, then at this 6-year-old who had just described a bilateral diplomatic arrangement she had brokered with her parent, apparently from a position of some leverage. "That is an excellent system," he said. "Thank you. It was my idea. Lee, can I ask you something?" "Sure, you can ask me anything." "Do you have friends here?" she asked. "Colleagues." "That's not the same thing." She said it with the certainty of someone who had already worked this out. "Friends are people who ask you how you actually are and wait for the real answer. Colleagues are people you're useful to." She looked around the room. "This room is full of colleagues." "Yes," he agreed, "it is." "Then I'll be your friend for tonight," she said, with the matter-of-fact generosity of someone offering something they have plenty of. "You need one, I can tell." She opened her iPad. "You're very observant," he said calmly. "My mum says that too. She says I notice things most people don't. I think it's because I'm small and I'm quiet when I need to be, so adults don't know I'm listening. It's useful." She said this as pure information. No pride in it, no calculation. Just the clear-eyed statement of someone who had discovered a feature of her situation and found it practically applicable. Lee looked at her for a long moment and felt something in his chest do something that he decided not to examine closely in a public venue. They talked. He was not entirely sure how it happened, how a man who had spent 2 decades controlling every room he entered, ended up in a corner of a gala event, surrendering willingly to a conversation with a 6-year-old. But it happened, and somewhere in the course of it, he stopped thinking about the people who wanted things from him, and stopped counting the minutes to a socially acceptable exit, and stopped doing any of the things he had arrived planning to do. She asked him if he had pets. He said no. She said she had a goldfish named Professor, and that Professor had thus far been a grave disappointment, but that she remained committed to him, because that was what you did with people, or fish, who weren't what you hoped they would be. You stayed committed. You didn't give up just because things were hard. He didn't say anything to that, but he heard it. She asked if he was married. He said no. She nodded, unsurprised. She asked what he did for work. He said he ran a business. She asked what kind. He said the complicated kind. She considered this and accepted it, the way children accept the versions of things adults offer when the full version isn't appropriate, without pressing, because they understand, instinctively, that there are rooms you aren't invited into yet. She made him laugh 4 more times after the first. Real laughs, the kind that came from somewhere internal and unguarded, the kind that cost something and therefore meant something. Diana King excused herself from the group with the practiced grace of a woman who had learned to leave conversations smoothly, without anyone quite registering that she was going. She walked across the room slowly, taking the longer route, which gave her time to observe before she arrived. She watched him listen to Charis, the way he was fully present in it, not the performed attentiveness of an adult managing a child, but actual listening. She walked toward them. Lee was mid-sentence. Charis was saying something about Professor the Goldfish, something precise, something mildly critical, and he had been listening, fully, the way he had learned to listen when it mattered. Then she said, "Mum is coming." He looked up and saw her. For a second, nothing else existed in the room. Not the voices, not the movement, not the quiet hum of business and money and conversation that filled the space. Just her, walking toward them. Composed, certain, entirely self-contained in a way that didn't ask for attention and yet held it anyway. He didn't look away. 1 second. 2. 3. Long enough to stop being casual. Long enough to mean something. Charis stopped talking, tilted her head, looked at him, then at her mother, then back at him. And with the quiet accuracy of someone who missed very little, she reached out and tapped his arm. "Lay." A small tap, just enough to bring him back. He blinked once. The room returned. His expression reset, not fully but enough. By the time Diana reached them, he was already composed again. But his eyes found her once more. This time, more controlled. Still deliberate. I was just about to send you an update. This is Lee. We met at the supermarket. He still has my bandage on, see? I'm his therapist tonight. He needed a mood shift, and I provided one. That's 3 services total." Diana looked at Lee. He had been sitting, she realized, at Charis's level on the ledge beside her, and straightened. He was tall. She had registered that in the supermarket, but not quite like this. He was looking at her with the same expression as before, calm, measured, waiting, not performing anything, just waiting, letting her decide what this was. "Yes, I remember you," Diana said. She doesn't usually spend time with people she doesn't know. "She told me. She said she makes exceptions for people who need help." Diana looked at Charis, who was making excellent use of this pause to send her update and appear to be doing something other than listening to every word being said. She knew better. Charis was always listening. "I'd feel more comfortable if she weren't." Charis interrupted, "Mum, I checked, he's fine." Both adults looked at her. She looked up from her iPad with the reasonable patience of someone who has been waiting for the appropriate moment to offer a summary. "He doesn't talk to me like I'm a small thing he has to manage. He actually listens. And his face does a sad thing when he thinks no one is looking, like when you're carrying something heavy but trying not to show it. You taught me about that. You said that kind of sad isn't dangerous, it's just tired." Diana was quiet. She had, in fact, said something very much like that, on a Sunday evening after a long shift, when Charis had asked her why some people had eyes that seemed far away even when they were standing right in front of you. She had not expected to have it quoted back to her as a character reference. She looked at Lee. He was not arguing, not pressing, not filling the silence with reassurances or explanations or any of the things that men did when they wanted to manage a woman's wariness rather than respect it. He was simply standing there, waiting, letting her work it out for herself. She made a decision. It was careful and considered and probably slightly unwise, and she made it anyway. "Fine," Deanna said. Charis nodded once, with the satisfaction of someone whose argument has concluded in the expected outcome. Then she turned to Lee with the focused air of a person transitioning to the next agenda item. Charis said in her little voice, "I provided you with 3 professional services tonight: therapy, comedy, and a medical follow-up. The going rate for all 3 is 1 ice cream. You will pay. My mum will come. I will choose the flavor." Lee looked at Diana. A very brief look, not asking permission exactly, but acknowledging that the decision was hers. Diana looked at her daughter, who was watching her with the patient, focused expression of someone who already knew the answer and was simply waiting for the other party to arrive at it. "Saturday," Lee said. "Saturday is fine. Mom will be free." She typed it into her iPad before he had finished saying it. Efficient, decisive, done. Charis had presented him with a printed, actually, formally printed and placed in a small folder list of ice cream flavor recommendations when they met outside the shop. She had annotated it. There were footnotes. Lee had stood on the street holding this document while Diana watched his face and tried to keep hers even. He had ordered what she recommended. He hadn't argued. She had approved of this without comment, in the way she approved of most things, with a brief nod and an immediate move to the next item. They walked. Charis walked between them and served as narrator, guide, and social director simultaneously, which she managed with the easy authority of someone who has always done 3 things at once and found it unremarkable. She pointed out the building with the prettiest roofline, the street that, in her expert assessment, had the best food smell, the shop with the cat in the window, Gerald. She had decided his name was Gerald. She had been visiting him for 2 months, and she was very nearly sure he recognized her now. Diana walked on one side and said careful things. Lee walked on the other and said less. But what he said fully, without filler, in the way that some people had learned to speak where every word was actually doing something. It was, Diana thought, despite herself, almost ordinary. That was the strange part. That it felt, in the afternoon light, walking down a street in Seoul with her daughter between them and ice cream melting at the edges, almost like something normal. And then, outside a coffee shop, a man came out of the door without looking, shoulder-checked Lee hard, looked at him, and said something. Low, dismissive, the kind of thing that was designed to test whether you were the kind of person who let things go or the kind that made you regret that you hadn't. Diana felt it before she saw it, a shift in the air beside her, the particular quality of stillness that preceded something. She had felt that quality before, in a different life, and the memory of it moved through her body before her mind had time to classify it. She looked at Lee. His jaw had tightened. His eyes had stilled. Something was moving through him. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, in the way his right hand had very slightly closed. Then he looked down. Charis was looking up at him, ice cream cone in her left hand, tilted slightly to one side because she had forgotten to be careful about it, watching him with that quiet, measuring attention of hers, not afraid, just watching, the way she watched things when she was recording them for later review. He breathed. She saw him do it, actually saw the decision move through his body, a visible piece of internal governance that was not small and did not come easily. He looked back at the man, held his gaze for exactly 1 beat, long enough to be deliberate, not long enough to be a provocation, then nodded once and kept walking. No scene, no consequence, just control. Diana filed it, said nothing. They walked back to the car in the late afternoon light, Charis's cone reduced to its last third, her narration continuing without pause through the return journey. When they got in the car, Lee driving, Diana in the passenger seat, Charis in the back with the focused air of someone about to make a closing statement, there was a pause. Charis leaned forward between the front seats. I saw what happened back there, with that man outside the coffee shop. Lee's hands were on the wheel. He didn't respond. That was hard for you. I could see that it was hard. But you looked at me, and you chose to do the hard thing instead of the easy one. Silence. The city moved past the windows. My mum calls that character. She says character is what you do when it costs you something. I think she's right. She sat back and returned to her ice cream, which had reached a critical structural phase and required attention. Case made. Verdict delivered. In the passenger seat, Diana looked out the window at the passing street and said nothing. A single brick in the wall had come loose. She was not ready to acknowledge it, but it had come loose. He had told himself he would not go back. He had told himself this clearly, and with what he considered to be reasonable conviction on Friday evening, reviewing the week behind him and the week ahead, and the various sensible reasons why a man in his position had no business visiting a doctor and her 6-year-old daughter on a Saturday morning with a bag of groceries. He had been standing outside their building at 9:15 with a bag of groceries. Charis opened the door, looked at the groceries, looked at him, and stepped aside with the manner of someone who has been proven correct again and finds it unsurprising. Charis, I told Mum you'd come. She said I was being optimistic. I told her I was being accurate. There's a difference. Come in, take your shoes off, we have a rule. He took his shoes off, put them by the door beside 2 very small pairs that belonged to Charis and 1 precise, professional pair that belonged to Diana. He stood in the hallway of this apartment in his socks and looked at what surrounded him. It smelled warm. That was the first thing. Like something good was either cooking or had recently been cooking, and like books, and like the particular inhabited smell of a space that people actually lived in, rather than simply occupied. There were drawings on the fridge, Charis's, clearly, bold, and confident and anatomically approximate in the way that 6-year-old drawings are, where enthusiasm has outrun technical precision, but the intention is unmistakable. There was a plant on the windowsill that was doing well, genuinely well, not surviving but thriving. There were 3 pairs of shoes by the door, and he had added his to them, and it looked like they belonged there, which was a thing he would not examine closely. Charis pulled him by the hand, both hands around 2 of his fingers, which was the grip she used when the matter was urgent, into the living room, where she had evidently prepared an agenda. He was to see her drawings. He was to meet Professor, he goldfish. He was to be taught the rules of a card game she had invented, which she would explain as they went, because the rules were responsive to the situation. He went. He sat on the floor of the living room, his floor in his suit trousers, cross-legged on a rug with cartoon animals on it, and lost 3 consecutive games of a card game whose rules changed subtly and strategically each time he appeared to be gaining an advantage. He did not point this out. He lost slowly enough that she didn't find it suspicious. She won with the focused satisfaction of someone who has prepared well and executed well and expects the record to reflect this. Between games, she told him about Professor the Goldfish, who lived in a bowl on the windowsill and who had, despite extended goodwill on Charis's part, failed to develop a personality. She had not given up on him, she said. He was just taking longer than expected. She also told him about her school, about her teacher who was good at most things but had opinions about the library that Charis had been quietly correcting for 2 months, and about a boy in her class who had told her that girls couldn't be doctors. Charis, he said girls aren't good at science. Lee, he's wrong. Charis, that's what I told him. Lee, good. That was the whole exchange. It lasted 4 seconds. Charis nodded and moved on to the next hand, satisfied. Lee picked up his cards. Diana stood in the kitchen doorway. She had not planned to stand there as long as she had. She had told herself she was simply passing through. But she had stopped, and she had been watching, and she was still watching, and she had been looking for the thing that would confirm what she already knew, that this was complicated, that this was inadvisable, that all her instincts were good instincts, and the wisest course was caution. She had been watching for 20 minutes. She had not found what she was looking for. She had found something else. She had found a man on her floor, playing a card game he was losing on purpose, telling her daughter she was right when she was right, and being entirely, unperformatively, genuinely present in the room he was in. She had been looking for danger. She kept finding something else. She didn't know why she had poured the wine. She had told herself it was the polite thing. He had been in her home for most of the day. He had helped with dinner. Charis had insisted on the story, then a second story, then requested that he sit in the chair by the bed for a few minutes, which had stretched into something longer. The wine was a social gesture. The logic, while not entirely airtight, had been available, and the wine was already poured. He came back from Charis's room quietly, found her in the living room, looked at the wine, looked at her, sat down across from her without comment, which she appreciated, because a comment would have required her to explain her logic, which, as noted, was not airtight. They talked at first about easy things, about Soul in Autumn, about the neighborhood, about Charis's school library project, which Diana described with the particular mix of pride and exasperation that was her default register when the subject was her daughter. He listened and asked one or two questions, and she noticed, again, that his questions were the kind that meant he had actually been listening, not just waiting to speak. The conversation found a deeper current. It happened the way those things happen, gradually, and then all at once, like a tide that has been coming in for some time and has finally reached the line you thought it wouldn't cross. She talked about Atlanta. She hadn't planned to. There was no decision made. It simply came out the way things come out when you have been carrying them for a long time and the conditions are unexpectedly right for putting them down. The wine was part of it, and the low light was part of it, and Charis being asleep was part of it, and the particular quality of his listening was a very large part of it. The way he sat, still and present, without any of the impatience that disguises itself as empathy. She told him about leaving, about the 3-year-old Charis, who had been too young to understand why but had accepted the fact of the change with the remarkable adaptability of children who do not yet know that things are supposed to be certain. About coming to Soul. About building something, a practice, a home, a life that was clean and structurally sound and wholly her own. She told him what it had done to her sense of her own judgment. That was perhaps the most honest part, and the hardest. That she had been wrong about someone she had chosen with intention, and that the wrongness had cost her in ways that were still compounding. That she had looked at a man and concluded safe and been incorrect, and that the recalibration after that was long and ongoing, and sometimes felt like a project that would take her entire remaining life. She was not performing any of this. She was not asking for anything. She was simply saying it out loud to another person in the low light of her living room, because she had been carrying it alone for long enough that the weight had become a kind of company. And tonight, for the first time in a long time, she had found herself in a room where putting it down for a moment felt possible. He listened. The full, actual, complete kind of listening that has become so rare that it reads almost as a language you have almost forgotten. No interruptions, no solutions offered, no reassurances produced at calculated intervals, no performing of empathy, just presence. Full, still, unhurried presence, the way a room holds its air. When she finished, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything that had just been said, and everything that didn't need adding to it. She looked at him, he was looking at her. She kissed him. It was not a decision, or it was a decision made somewhere below the level of deciding, in the half-second before the thinking part of her caught up and registered what the rest of her had already done. Soft, intentional, brief. She pulled back. The thinking part had arrived. I'm scared of what you are. He didn't move, didn't reframe it, didn't tell her she was wrong to be scared, or that her fear was misplaced, or that he was different from what she thought. He simply held her gaze and told her the truth. I know. I don't want my daughter near that world. I don't want her to know it exists. I understand. A long moment, the city outside, the quiet of the apartment, Professor in his bowl on the windowsill observing. I want to be part of your lives, he said slowly. She looked at him. The want in that sentence was real, she could hear it, and she had excellent hearing for the difference between real and performed want, because the difference had mattered before. This was real, which was the problem and not the solution. She shook her head, not cruelly, honestly. She stood and told him he could take the guest room, that Charis would love to see him in the morning. He nodded, said good night, and they went in separate directions down the same hallway, each carrying a different weight of the same impossible thing. The next morning, he had found the ingredients. He had found the pan. He had made a decision about pancakes that was, in retrospect, more ambitious than his practical skill set warranted. He was a man who had managed, over the course of a long and varied career, any number of complex situations requiring precise execution. The pancakes were not going as well as those situations had gone. First attempt too thick. Second attempt too thin and slightly sad. Third attempt burned at the edge, salvageable in theory, not in practice. He was calibrating a fourth attempt when the door opened. Charis stood in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, hair free of its braids and substantially expanded by a night of sleep, looking at him with the particular focused calm of someone who has encountered a situation and is forming an assessment. "You're still here," she said calmly. "I'm still here," he replied. "Are those supposed to be pancakes?" She looked at the counter. "They are pancakes. They're in an early developmental phase," he responded. She climbed onto the counter beside the stove, with the complete absence of permission that characterized everything she did, settled herself on the edge, and leaned over to inspect the pan with the focused assessment of a consultant who has been brought in to evaluate a project and is reserving judgment. "The heat is too high. Also, you're not waiting long enough before you flip. You have to let it decide when it's ready. You can't rush it." He turned the heat down. She watched him pour the next one. She watched it with the patience of someone who has decided to see this through and is prepared to wait. When the edges began to firm and the surface began to bubble, she pointed at it. "Now." He flipped it. It was a pancake, golden, round, structurally sound. He looked at it, looked at her. She examined it from her position on the counter and gave it a single approving nod. "Better make more." He made more. She supervised from the counter, occasionally offering refinements, occasionally sampling a test piece, and delivering her verdict with the considered seriousness of a quality assessor. Diana appeared in the doorway. She had clearly not anticipated what she found, her daughter installed on the counter, him at the stove, the kitchen warm with the smell of something working after several attempts. She stood in the doorway and took it in, her daughter's braids still loose, his suit jacket over the chair back, pancakes stacking on the plate, morning light doing what morning light does, making everything look more settled than it is. She went to the cupboard, got plates, set the table quietly without comment. Charis jumped down from the counter and helped, placing things with the particular precision of someone who had been taught that a properly set table was worth doing properly. They ate together. The morning light was gentle and the pancakes were good, genuinely good, from the fourth attempt onward, and Charis told them at length about the dream she'd had, which had involved Professor the Goldfish competing in a swimming competition. The other competitors had lodged formal objections on the grounds of category, but Professor had prevailed, and the committee had ruled in his favor, and Charis was very pleased about this outcome, even if he would never know it. Lee ate and listened and laughed and forgot, for approximately 45 minutes, everything that was waiting for him on the other side of this morning. He had not forgotten something for 45 consecutive minutes in a very long time. Charis finished her third pancake and announced that she was going to brush her teeth because she had been told consistently and by a dentist mother that this was not optional, and departed with her characteristic efficiency. The kitchen was quiet. Lee set down his fork, looked at Diana. "I want to apologize for last night," he said gently. She looked at him evenly. "You don't need to." "I meant what I said, about wanting to be part of this." She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, it came from somewhere clear and sure, not from anger, not from softness, but from the bedrock of everything she had built and everyone she had built it for. Then you need to change. He held her gaze. My daughter deserves a safe life. Not an exciting one, not an interesting one, a safe one. I didn't come to Seoul and build everything we have here to bring something dangerous in through the front door. I won't do that. Not for anyone. He nodded. Not quickly, it came slowly, like something that had been resisting and had finally been persuaded. He got up, thanked her for the morning, for the room, put on his jacket, and walked to the door where he put on his shoes carefully, the way you put on shoes when you are thinking about something else, and left. Quietly, the way men leave when they are carrying something they haven't yet decided what to do with it. His office was at the top of a building in Yeonggu that overlooked the Han River on a clear day. Today was a clear day. He wasn't looking at the river. He was looking at his desk, one corner of it specifically where a small thing sat that had no business being in this room. He'd brought it here at some point, without deciding to, from the bathroom drawer to his jacket pocket to the desk, without quite acknowledging at any stage that he was doing it. It had stars on it, faded now. One edge had curled slightly. He picked it up. He thought about what he had built, the decade of it, the way he'd risen by being useful in specific ways to specific people who operated in specific registers of power that didn't exist in clean language. He'd told himself for years that he was practical, that the world he moved in was the world that existed, that the line between legitimate and not legitimate was thinner than people who lived entirely on one side of it liked to believe. He thought about the little girl who was scared of him, saw him bleeding and offered to help him. He thought about the card game with the shifting rules, played on a rug with cartoon animals, and the way she had won and been satisfied without needing him to be diminished by losing. He thought about the ice cream date and the confrontation outside the coffee shop and the 4 seconds it had taken him to choose, and the way she had leaned forward from the back seat afterward and said, I saw what you did. That was hard, but you did it anyway. He thought about Diana's voice, steady and clean. Then you need to change. Not please change, not I wish you were different, just the truth laid flat, the condition, the real thing. His phone lit up, an associate, someone who had been waiting 3 days for an answer that kept the current arrangement intact. He looked at the phone. He thought about Cheris writing in her notebook, honest about self. That's good. He put the phone face down. Picked up a different one. He called a lawyer, a specific one, the kind who specialized in the slow, painstaking, unglamorous work of extraction, pulling a person and their interests out of complicated arrangements legally, documentably, permanently. It was expensive. It took time. It required burning things he'd spent years building. I need to start a process, he said when the line connected. What kind? He looked at the bandage in his hand, at the faded stars. The kind that changes everything, he said. He set it back on the corner of his desk when he hung up, carefully, where he could see it. He chose them. He had waited 4 weeks before calling her. He had understood, without needing it explained, that showing up again before anything had actually changed would be exactly the thing she had spent 6 years training herself not to believe. Another man saying what he needed to say to be allowed through the door. He was not going to do that. He was going to do the work first. 4 months. He didn't contact them, not because he didn't want to. Cheris's diplomatic goldfish appeared in his mind at the most arbitrary moments. 3 in the morning, in the middle of meetings, in traffic. He thought about Diana's hands steady around a wine glass, the specific brave architecture of a woman who had learned to be careful and was trying to learn to be something else simultaneously. But he had said he would change. And he understood, with the patience of someone who had spent a decade being strategic about things that mattered, that showing up in the middle of a process and saying, trust me, it's happening was not the same as showing up when the process was complete. One was a promise. The other was evidence. He wanted to give her evidence. So he worked. It was not easy. Extraction from arrangements built on mutual dependency and implicit threat was a slow, careful, expensive thing. There were conversations that required the most controlled version of himself, deployed now in the service of an exit rather than an advance. Bridges burned. Agreements dissolved. Assets moved into structures that couldn't be leveraged against him. He did it completely. He was not a man who did things halfway. When it was finished, documented finished, the lawyer confirmed, signed, and sealed finished, he sat in his quiet office and understood that he had made himself significantly less powerful in the world he'd been operating in. He felt relief, clean and unfamiliar, like fresh air in a room that had been closed for years. He went to their building on a Saturday, 2:00 exactly. He'd thought about calling ahead and decided against it. This was a showing up kind of moment, not a phone call kind of moment. He stood at the door and knocked. Quick footsteps, cherry-shaped footsteps, the door opened. She looked up at him. She did the small, quick, invisible calculation she did with everything, assessed, processed, concluded. Then, "You came back," she said. Not surprised, not performing relief, just nodding a fact that had been predicted and had now been confirmed on schedule. "I came back," he said. She looked at him, really looked, the way she looked at her rocks, weighing the thing against what it was supposed to feel like. Then she stepped back from the door and turned her head. "Mom," she said, not loudly, just enough. Footsteps from the kitchen. Diana came around the corner and stopped. She was in weekend clothes, soft trousers, a worn sweatshirt, her hair down. She looked like what she was off-duty, a person, rather than the performance of a doctor or a woman who had everything organized and handled. She looked real. She looked like herself. She looked at him in the doorway and didn't move. He held her gaze. "I'm done," he said. "What I was part of, I'm out. Legally, completely documented. I'll show you every piece of paper if you want to see it." He paused. "I know you can't trust that on my word. Trust isn't how this works, I know that. I'm asking for the chance to start the part where you decide." Another pause. "That's all I'm asking." She looked at him. She looked at his hands, both of them, at his sides, clean. No new marks on his knuckles. She looked at his face. She was a doctor. She had looked at 1,000 people in crisis and learned to read what was real underneath what was presented. His eyes were steady. They were scared, she could see that, but they were steady. She looked at Charis. Charis looked back with the expression of someone who has been the project manager of a very long initiative and is watching the final milestone complete. Diana looked at the door, then she stepped back. She held it open. He crossed the threshold. Charis immediately took his hand, the way she'd done it the first time, without announcement, just as established fact, and started pulling him toward the kitchen. "We're making dinner," she said. "You're helping. I'm going to teach you the correct way to cut an onion because you look like someone who does it wrong." "Charis," Diana started. "He stayed for pancakes," Charis said. "Dinner is significantly less complex than pancakes." She looked up at Li Wang. "Do you know how to cut an onion?" "Apparently not correctly," he said. "Good, teachable." She led him into the kitchen. "Mom, can you get him an apron, the blue one?" Diana stood at the door for one moment. Then she went and got the blue apron. She handed it to him. He put it on. Charis immediately critiqued the tying of it. He redid it to her specifications. He stood at the counter and let a 6-year-old instruct him in onion technique with the focus and seriousness he brought to everything, and the kitchen filled with their voices and the smell of garlic and something warm happening, and Diana stood at the far counter and listened and felt the walls she'd built. Carefully, necessarily, brick by patient brick, he looked at her across the kitchen. "One step," he said. She picked up her knife. "One step," she agreed. Charis, between them, corrected his knife angle. Outside, Seoul moved through its Saturday, enormous, beautiful, indifferent to any one of its 10 million small stories. Somewhere in it, things were large and loud and consequential. In this kitchen, something quiet was happening. A woman who had run 12,000 kilometers to be safe was slowly, carefully, deciding what safe could look like when it wasn't just walls. A man who had spent a decade in the wrong world was discovering that the thing he'd been missing the whole time was the most ordinary thing. A warm kitchen, a child with opinions about onions, a woman standing close enough that he could hear her exhale. And Charis, who had known exactly how this would end from the moment she'd stood in front of a dangerous man in a supermarket and decided his wounds needed attending to, was correcting knife technique and doing it with the quiet satisfaction of someone watching a plan execute flawlessly. She gave it 4 minutes. Then she looked up. "You know what I'm going to say," she told her mother. "Don't," Diana said, but there was a smile underneath it, real and helpless. "I was right," Charis said simply. "Charis? I'm providing documentation of outcomes." She looked at Li Wang. "You're welcome, by the way." He looked at her. "For what specifically?" "The bandage was the beginning," Charis said. "Everything after that was just follow-through." She looked between them with the complete satisfaction of a person whose thesis has been conclusively proven. "You're both very lucky I was paying attention that day." He looked at this small person, this 6-year-old who had walked toward him when the whole world walked away, who had put a star-patterned bandage above his eyebrow and asked him, honestly, if he was a bad man, and had in doing so set in motion every single thing that had led to this kitchen, this evening, this particular version of himself that he was still in the process of becoming. "Yes," he said, and he meant it completely. "We are." Here is what Diana learned about Li Wang. In the months that followed, one step at a time, building something out of materials they were both careful with. He showed up to what he said he'd show up to. This sounds small. It is not small. Diana was a doctor. She understood that the most important data was longitudinal, not the single point but the pattern over time. He was consistent. Not dramatically, not with speeches, just there, adjusting his schedule when something came up without making her feel guilty for the adjustment, learning that Charis slept late on Sundays and arriving accordingly. Remembering, without being reminded, that she didn't like mushrooms and had strong feelings about the correct water temperature for making tea, and kept her most important things in a small box under her bed. He told her things, not all at once. He told them the way you let air into a room that's been shut, a little at a time, letting it equalize. He told her who he'd been, what he'd been part of. He didn't make it easier to hear than it was. She appreciated that more than she could say, that he didn't clean it up for her, that he let it be what it was and trusted her to decide what to do with the truth. She told him things, too. The parts that still had edges on them, that she hadn't said out loud to anyone because saying them out loud meant they were real, and she'd been very busy making herself too competent to need them to be real. He listened the same way he'd listened that first night, completely, without agenda, without the performance of understanding. Just actually there. Charis supervised the whole thing with the calm satisfaction of a senior consultant watching an initiative. She designed deliver, exactly, the results she projected. She made him a chart. Of course she made him a chart, a proper one on paper with 2 columns. At the top she'd written in her careful handwriting, Li Wang, progress and development metrics. Column A was current performance, column B was targets. He met most of the column B requirements. She'd noted this with a small check. She'd also noted the development areas, which were 1. Learns to cook at least 3 dishes from scratch without consulting YouTube mid-process. 2. Gets better at losing at board games without his jaw doing the thing. I can see the jaw thing, Li Wang. 3. Occasionally lets mom be right even about things she's not technically right about, because she is still learning to trust her own judgment again after Atlanta, and someone practicing the graceful concession around her would be a kindness. He stared at the 3rd item for a long time. Then he showed it to Diana without comment. She stared at the 3rd item for a long time. "She's not wrong," she said finally. "I know," he said. He learned to make 3 dishes from scratch. He worked on the jaw. He lost 2 arguments he was confident he'd won, gracefully and without visible effort, and Diana had accepted both victories and savored them. And then, about a month later, she'd looked at him sideways during a quiet evening and said, "You're doing the thing, aren't you?" And he'd said, "Charis recommended it." And she'd stood up and gone to Charis's room and knocked and opened the door, and Charis had said, "You're welcome," before she'd even finished the opening sentence. "How did you know what I was going to say?" Diana demanded. Charis looked up from her book. "Because you've been confident in the last 2 arguments, and he conceded both of them, and you know him well enough now to know when he's conceding on purpose." She turned a page. You're welcome. Charis, who had known from the moment she pressed a small, star-covered bandage above a stranger's eyebrow in a supermarket on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, that this was the beginning of something. That kindness is never small. That the smallest act of care, one bandage, one honest question, one child who is not afraid, can, if the conditions are right and the people are brave enough, change the entire shape of a life. Or two. Or three. If you watch this whole story from the supermarket to the kitchen to the chart with the jaw comment, you already know Charis was carrying this entire family from chapter 1. Drop a comment with your favorite moment. If you want a part 2 of this story, then drop a comment. Subscribe for more stories about second chances, brave women, dangerous men choosing differently, and the small children who somehow see it all before anyone else does. See you in the next one.